Yeah, hello everyone. And as you can see, I'm number 21 Mythic. And today, I'm going to show you the deck that I used to get me there. So, that deck is Sultai. Now, Sultai in this format is just the general mishmash of good cards in the format. It uses the big combo in the deck, which I've kind of coined the splinter twin of this format, is Nissa plus Pact of Negation. So, Nissa doubles all your forests. So, most of your lands are forests. So what that means is that when you play Pact of Negation, usually you have to time walk yourself the next turn. That's the downside of Pact of Negation. But Nissa allows you to just play Pact, usually off 3 lands. So you have like your breeding pool and another forest and another island. You can just play your Pact off those 3 lands and untap one of those lands with Nissa. So you basically only use 2 lands to play for your Pact, and you got to develop your Nissa onto the board, which is a very strong play. Then you have things like Thoughtseize and Thought Erasure to disrupt your opponent, which also help to fuel the graveyard for Uro. So, I think the notable part of this list, that not many lists have been using, is the addition of Vraska and my current sideboard. So, Vraska is key, because there's a lot of spots when you play this deck where you go Growth Spiral or Explore on 2, and you can't really use your mana well on 4. So, like, for example, if you're playing against Bant or Sultai, and you're going to bring, a lot of the Sultai lists have the sweepers on 4. So if you're playing against something like Bant or Sultai, you're not going to want to sweep on 4. And you're just going to waste mana that you just got off your Growth Spiral and Explore. And if you're wasting it, there's not even much point in Growth Spiral or Exploring. So in those matchups, instead of playing the sweepers like we have in our sideboard, you get to slam Vraska. And Vraska is great because, say, for against Bant, for example, a lot of their turn 3s can be Narset. Like, you could go Explore, then they go Narset, and then you go Vraska and kill Narset, which is just a very strong play for you. It develops your board and destroys what they're doing, and then they have to answer your Vraska, and then you can just follow it up with a Nissa, which pressures their planeswalkers even more. So, the next big addition, like I told you before, was the sideboard. So in the board, we have, I'll explain what all the cards do now one by one. So we have Aether Gust. So Aether Gust is really good. As it says, it seems kind of simple, but it's really good against any red or green deck. The only deck I don't like to bring it in against that is green is Bant. Because Bant, the only green card that really matters in the matchup is Uro. And Uro is just one of the weaker cards anyways, so I don't really like gusting it, especially when you have Vraska to just clean it up, and you can just go bigger with things like Krasis. Then we have Negate. Negate's just like a stable sideboard card, comes in against control and the mirror matches. Just anytime there's non-creature spells that are troublesome, you want to bring in Negate. Tail's End. Now, Tail's End is a strange-looking card. So, you might think, well, Tail's End, that's a real situational counterspell. It seems like it until you realize there's just so many things in the format that it deals with. Bolas's Citadel, Muxus, Shark Typhoon Cycle, Priest of the Forgotten Gods activation. Just different things like that where you can bring in Tail's End, and it's just a nice, clean, efficient answer to different things. Then we have 4 Heartless Acts. So Heartless Act is good when Eliminate isn't. So say if you're playing against Gruul, and Gruul has like Questing Beast and Glorybringer and different things like that. You still want the Eliminates, but the Heartless Acts are a good addition because you can kill their 4s and 5 drops. Scavenging Ooze. Now, the main reason I added Scavenging Ooze to this deck was because I seen Croakies was advocating for people to play the Mono Black Godpharaoh's Gift deck. So what I've noticed on the ladder is, when Croaky advocates for a deck, you're going to see it a lot. So I wanted to make sure my deck was suited well to beat that deck. And Scavenging Ooze does that. Scavenging Ooze is probably the best sideboard card in this deck. So I brought it to beat the Croaky's Godpharaoh's Gift deck, but it just turned out that Scavenging Ooze was the tool I wanted to convert my deck from a ramp deck to a mid-range deck in the matchups where I need to do that. I found, like, against things like Goblins or against things like Sacrifice, I can just play a Krasis, and I just die to a Citadel or a Muxus anyways. So that big 8/8 Krasis isn't really accomplishing anything. Whereas, if I go lean to the ground, I can just disrupt their creatures with Thoughtseize and Thought Erasure removal spells, and then use Scavenging Ooze to outgrow whatever's left over. And you just end up pulling ahead. Next up, we have 2 Extinction Event and 1 Ritualist Soot. So these are our sweepers. They come in against all the creature decks pretty much. And obviously against certain things you might not want Ritual, and against certain things you might not want Extinction, which is why I like to split. I'm not a big fan of Languish, because against something, say, like Auras, it can be kind of awkward. It's also awkward against like a lot of bigger creatures, such as Uro, where there might be some matchup where you want the Extinction Event or Ritual, but Languish is just awkward. I think Ritual, in my opinion, Ritual hits everything that Languish does, pretty much, while also hitting the Auras deck really nicely. Because that was usually the big reason you'd split Extinction Event and Languish, was against auras, you really didn't want Languish. Their creature would just grow too big and wouldn't be able to do anything. At least Ritual always kills the creatures. While also not having the downside of only hitting one side of the CMCs, like Extinction Event has. So, Ugin. So, Ugin usually is used as a finisher against the aggro decks to sweep up the board. Generally, when I play this deck, I don't like to bring an Ugin against the aggro decks. Since I said before, where I have Scavenging Ooze now and the plan to go lower, I don't like bringing an Ugin in those matchups. I like Ugin in the control matchups and the mirror matches, because you just want to go bigger than the other person in those matchups. So now, I'm going to cut to me going through some sideboard notes for you to figure out how to board with the deck. What are you at? Hello everyone and welcome to Sideboarding. So, for example, against Goblins, I'd board in 1 Tail's End, 1 Aether Gust, 4 Heartless Act, 3 Scavenging Ooze, 2 Extinction Event, and 1 Ritualist Soot. I'd take out 4 Krasis, 3 Pact of Negation, 3 Nissa Who Shakes the World, 1 Castle Vantress, and 1 Island. So, as you can see here, I'm boarding on a lot of the ramp elements on my deck. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to get low to the ground. I just want to go in, I want to disrupt them with, say, Thoughtseize, Thought Erasure, my removal spells, and I want to get under them with things like Scavenging Ooze, and make a quick Uro after I've killed all their threats. So my Scavenging Ooze and Uro can try to fight their creatures one-on-one, because generally, one-on-one, Scavenging Ooze and Uro are going to be more powerful cards than things such as, I don't know, a Goblin Chieftain by themselves. So, against the aggro decks, you want to take the plan I did against Goblins and change it depending on the matchup. So for example, against the flying aggro decks, so things like Spirits or Mono Blue, I don't really like the Scavenging Ooze, because the Scavenging Ooze is a ground threat, it's not that great. So in that matchup, I still like to stay a little bigger. But I don't really like my Nissas, because they're playing things like Lofty Denial and cheap counter magic that can interact with my threats. So in that matchup, I probably wouldn't bring in the Scavenging Oozes, and I'd just keep the Krasis. Because the Krasis, even if they have a counterspell, is still going to gain me some life and draw me some cards. So if they're just passing and holding up that mana, I'm not stuck just jamming a Nissa into it and getting no value for the turn. At least with the Krasis, if it still gets countered, I'm still going to get some value out of it. So, that's how I board against like the aggro decks. Now, for something more slow and controlling, Bant/Sultai. This is where the Ugins come in, and some of the counterspells. So obviously, according to the matchup, I changed the counterspells I'd bring in. So for example, against Bant and Sultai, I'm bringing in 1 Negate, 1 Tail's End, and 2 Ugin. But against just Sultai, I like Aether Gust. The reason for this is because against Bant, their main Planeswalker, which is what the matchup's determined around, is Teferi, Hair of Dominaria. But in Sultai, it's Nissa. So, since it's Nissa, I want Aether Gust to answer the Nissa. Now, you might think also, boarding out Thoughtseize is weird against Sultai. So in these Bant and Sultai matchups, you can generally, well in the Sultai mirror specifically, a lot of the time you can just discard each other and you both have no cards in your hand. And when you both have no cards in your hand, you really don't want to be drawing things like Thoughtseize. Also, you need to hit all your land drops. The more cards in your deck that are not just dedicated to either being a payoff or just getting you lands is a detriment to you. I don't like having to keep Thoughtseize and Thought Erasure in my deck in the matchup. But it's a necessary evil, because you can't let them resolve things like Ulamog or Ugin on you. You need to discard those spells out of their hand, and then hopefully you can develop your threats before they can develop theirs. So thank you for listening. If you still have any trouble sideboarding with the deck, or you need any help about anything, you can just DM me on Twitter. It's linked on my YouTube if you're looking for it. And that's it for me today. Bye!